Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm back here with Inez. Inez, how are you?
I'm good. I didn't just come off a plane like you did, so I'm fairly comfy here.
Yeah. Have you spent a lot of time in Texas?
Some time, but only in a couple of the cities, and I feel like they're all so different. My favorite part of Texas that I've seen is San Antonio. Just reminds me more of the West, but
Okay. I've never been to San Antonio, so I've been to Austin a few times, and then I've been to. Uh, so this one time was to Dallas, and I don't know if I just got not a great, like section of Dallas, but I described it as a scorching strip mall on Twitter,
I think that's
and
most Texas cities,
yeah, that's what people said, and
honestly.
nobody really disputed that. But you're telling me San Antonio has charms. Okay, I need to check out
Actually,
San
on that
Antonio.
count, San Antonio is, I think, better. If you go to the old city, it's got a lot of, I mean, obviously, a lot of Western history there. TR recruited the Rough Riders at one of the old hotels there. They have a bar that's been around for, it's really, I like the old city. Yeah.
Yeah, is it like sort of a Spanish style, like
Yeah.
San
It's
Diego
all,
or
it's
something like that?
all like Spanish style architecture that's been there for quite some time. And I like it a lot better because I don't like that strip mall large. Look, I know people move to Texas. They don't move to Texas because of because it's a walkable city or something like that. They move because of economic opportunity, and certainly the state has done really well in a lot of those things. But I can't do the sprawled suburbia. I don't like LA for that reason either.
Yeah, we're not real Americans. I guess the real Americans do appreciate strip mall. There has to be a reason the country looks that way. But okay. And so yeah, I'm back in LA. And I've been following, and as you've been following this OceanGate thing, where these five people went down to explore the Titanic. Do you have any Titanic? I was watching the CBS report, and this woman had been saving for 30 years, right? To go down and see the Titanic. Do you get this? Like, I think like a lot of women have these like celebrity or like women sometimes are into the Titanic. Like, do you have any understanding of like someone who would do something like that?
I think there's probably a lot more dudes that are into the Titanic, the actual wreck, not the movie, right? Just because it seems to me like one of those dude obsessions like World War II or the Roman Empire. Um, but I have a really good friend who is one of these Titanic obsessives, and been chatting with him about this, and sort of if he had had the money, I think he probably totally would have gotten into a tiny sub to go and see the wreckage of the Titanic because he's really interested in the history of it. So it's a
Yeah.
sad incident.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so and my idea is like, look, people in the abstract wish we had like a more risk taking society, we had a more dynamic society, we had people who are going out and trying to do new things, and then the instant something happens, right, we turn around and we say, "Where were the regulators?" Right, and from my perspective, these were people who took their own risk. I think one of them was like a 15-year-old boy, so maybe because he's a minor, maybe that's different. But they sign a waiver, and then the Coast Guard goes and looks for them, and so maybe that's like a hole in the system, and like they cost the rest of society something if they get lost. But I don't think people will be satisfied if you just say, well, the Coast Guard is not going to go look for them, right? I think that's not like the point, right? I think that's sort of a red herring. Um, but these are adults, well-informed adults, and they're making a decision, and like this is risk. This is what it is. And like I don't think you can just you can say you like progress and you like dynamism, and then say our sort of attitude is nobody can ever die. Do you have like a similar reaction to this?
Yeah, there's also, I mean, I have that reaction for sure. Also something about, vitalism and the courage to explore things. This seems to me, obviously, this is sort of a decadent version of that instinct, right? It's not like they're really exploring the frontiers of the ocean for some kind of intrinsic or advancement or discovery. They are taking a joyride, or they were. Um, but I still find that impulse more admirable than the impulse to pile on them for doing it. I mean, I would be very afraid to do that, for good reason, as it turns out. But, I think they knew they were doing something dangerous, but they were going to do it anyway because it interested them enough to see this wreck of the Titanic. I don't see anything to criticize there. I see something to some extent to admire. Obviously, you don't want that you want some sort of parameters on that impulse, or at least a counterbalance. If everybody in a civilization is like that, you very quickly, burn out. But it just seemed to me very actually quite American, and not because it's unique to Americans, this kind of impulse, but because America's still a young country. We don't have some of that world weariness. It's still in our uh, manifest destiny, and the push west is still like part of our national imagination. The closing of the West and the frontier was such a small period of our history, honestly. Like the part that we see in Westerns, maybe, 30, 40 years, really. But it has this outsized sort of sense in our culture, and how foreigners see us as well. I mean, I think there's a large part of that frontier culture that's identified with Americans, right, from abroad. And I find the impulse to dump on something like this to be small souled in a deep way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Are people really um are people really dumping, like, I've seen, like, have you seen anyone like attack the actual people who's not like an anonymous socialist? Like, I've not been on Twitter, so I've been flying, but have you seen, like, yes, I feel I've seen a lot of people say attacking the people who are attacking, them. I've seen people attack the CEO. I've seen people attack the company. And it's not, I don't it's not true that it's just a joyride, because once you make a discovery, once you try something and it works, it can be used in other places. So withstanding pressure to go underwater, that is not something that just has to
Right, but we
stay.
already have. I mean, this was a new design, but we already have
Well, it was
some
much. It's
craft
much
that can
cheaper.
go much, much. Yeah, look, I, I, I don't know what their impulse was to extent that anybody's attacking them. I've seen a lot. The sentiment I've seen a lot broader than anonymous tankies on the internet. Is it's sort of a species of the argument. I think when we were going to the moon, you had a lot of protesters with signs that say like we can't even feed all the hungry children. Why are we going to the
Yeah,
moon? And
Whitey on the
I've
Moon was like a song at the time.
right, and I think I've seen a lot of that. Like if we can't save all the migrants, for example, like why are we going after these 5 billionaires? Why are we bothering to try to save them? You know, why are resources, quote unquote, going into, and the same criticism is leveled at Elon Musk too about SpaceX, right? Like, why are you spending all these billions of dollars on space travel when you could spend it feeding hungry children here at home and on Earth? And I do think that's kind of a small-souled uh, sort of way of looking at human advancement and the possibilities of our species, really. And I'm not being particularly articulate, but I really dislike this sort of crabs in a bucket instinct. It seems very just kind of contemptible to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think that like people need a story. I mean, people need like sort of something to be pushing towards, and like, look, like, exploration and technological advancement does help people in the end, and I think that there's like, there is like the socialist logic of just like, oh, if Elon Musk doesn't go to space, then like the civil war in Congo will, be over or something, right? It's just like this very like simplistic understanding of like moving resources around. But what I'm concerned about this is like, I think it's gonna have a regulatory response, and maybe not even in this ocean diving space. Maybe like also like in space. Like I've heard people say, "Oh, look, ocean, the Sky Blue is like also has like these safety issues." Is that that's the Bezos this Bezos space exploration thing, right? And so people are like, NASA has like killed like a pretty large portion of people they sent into space, right? It's inherently very hard. And what happened was they just like didn't do like the kinds of these kinds of like ambitious missions anymore, and that's like how they stopped killing people. And so it's like, I mean, you look at like the investigation, like the exploration of like the Western Hemisphere or like most parts of the world. I mean, there had to be people who took risks. So yeah, I mean, this is just something that like I think we should live with. I mean, when it's adults who can know the risk and who can know like to take it upon themselves. The CEO was down there with the vehicle underwater. He believed enough in it. Yeah, I don't think like I really hope like the regulators like don't come for this kind of stuff, because I think that would be a disastrous result.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll talk about this more when we talk about stuff not working and increase in sort of industrial accidents. And, but there is some aspect of this. I think it is increasing. I guess I have 2 points. One, there is a gendered aspect to this, right? I think men tend to be more comfortable with risk. It makes sense biologically why that would be so, right? Women protect children at home. If we're thinking about evolutionary biology, I think women are much more uncomfortable, or most women are much more uncomfortable with huge risks in a way that especially young men are. That's why if you've ever seen that internet clip where there's the two kids and one of them, like the girl goes very carefully down the slide and she's sort of like inching her way down. And then her little brother comes behind her and it's literally like flies head first off the slide, right? There is something inherent in this. It produces a more dynamic economy when you have more of that kind of risk taking. It also produces more volatility, more, potential for accidents and stuff like that. But hopefully, just like in life, there's a sort of balance between the male and female impulses here that maybe it wouldn't be good to have a country all full of, Elon Musks. But on the other hand, we don't really want, and we're seeing this now, we don't really want, managerial economy and society run by HR women in middle age, with all of their sort of impulses, right? To safetyism, to communal decision making, to against grandiose risk. We're seeing, I think, the downsides of having a society like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the guy might have been a fool. I mean, I don't know like anything about the science, and neither does anyone else. Commenting, on this thing. But what I do know is that like you try things, and sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes things that sound crazy, do end up working, and you build on human knowledge. So yeah, we're in the same space here. I don't think it is that decadent. I mean, I think going down and seeing the Titanic is pretty cool. I mean, of all the things you can do in the world, there's worse ways to spend $250,000.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think this is a more noble way to spend your money than another party in Dubai.
Yeah, especially in Dubai. Yeah, and then
And
there's
I picked
like,
it for a reason.
yeah, you're flying in Beyonce or whatever. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and they did bring scientists. I mean, there was the CBS report from 6 months ago. They did bring scientists like on this sometimes, and like it's like some people said, yeah, we already know how to get to the ocean floor. Like yes, but like cost is everything, and like there's an entire universe of like underwater. Marine life that we know very little about, right? And so any scientific advancement in this area is going to like bring knowledge to the world. And so yeah, I mean, it just I mean, I think like I think you explore, you break things, and then people who are willing to take the risks have to be willing to take the risk. So yeah, I think we agree. We have pretty much the same instincts on this. Um, Okay, well, we our condolences to the five people who lost their lives here. We're recording just after it was announced that I don't think they found the bodies, but they found like the debris. So, like, yeah, they're saying they're probably gone. Okay, and so, yeah, the other thing I wanted to talk about was there's this Ezra Klein piece. He said, that he had an op-ed where he talks about he read DeSantis's book, and he thinks political books are important. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but he says, that's like sort of it's telling you how the politician wants to be seen by the world. And then there's a Ezra Klein podcast where he talks to a guy named Carlos Lozado, I think is his name. He's Carlos Lozada. He's another columnist. Um, and you read this too. What did what was your take on sort of the Ezra Klein take on DeSantis? Because I thought there was like something's old here, but something's new too.
Yeah, it's funny to see your own views sort of, or your own perceptions reflected back at you from this sort of funhouse mirror analysis. So in that sense, it was kind of fun to listen to this podcast. I don't know if I share the idea that, or the view that political books are really important. I think too often they're ghost written. Maybe the presidential candidate, gives some direction to the book, but most of the time it's really bland pablum that you could get from listening to two speeches from that person expanded into a book form. But I'm happy to uh, happy to posit there might be exceptions to that. I have not read this DeSantis book either, but there seemed to be a couple critiques they made on the podcast. One was that his perspective from the Tea Party days has changed considerably from a focus on constitutional norms to a focus on crushing his enemies, and doing it in a systematic and competent way. One, they kind of intimate that, oh, maybe he's just going with the winds of the party. I find that really, really unlikely given how many millions of Republican voters have gone the same way, including me. So that indicates, perhaps, since we're not running for office, or that there's something to this. I think I've seen it memeified in form, the political grid of sort of authoritarian left and right and so on, is sort of the libertarian right is symbolized by the no step on snake, right? The curled up, don't tread on me snake. And then the authoritarian left is symbolized by like a boot coming down to crush the snake, and then the snake sort of rising up into the authoritarian right quadrant. I think that describes my political sort of changes over the last 12 years or so, since I was a big Tea Party person. It's really how I entered politics. I joined the Tea Party in a couple different states, actually, just because I was moving around at that time, and found the people that I was around enormously admirable. I think it shaped a lot of my democratic and populist views of being around these people, which I hadn't really. My parents are immigrants. I'd lived in the Bay Area in California, had heard about the knuckle draggers of the country. Really did not find that description to fit the people that I was alongside in the Tea Party. But yeah, I think there's a very organic way to move. And I think it's largely what happened. That the Tea Party was sort of the gentleman's revolt. It was pointing to a lot of the excesses of the left in ignoring the constitutional structure and culture, basic culture of the country. And when that didn't work, the gentleman's revolt essentially didn't work. The type of people who were in the Tea Party tended to be small business owners. I think even the New York Times at the time was so shocked to report the education level of the Tea Party. Average Tea Party respondent to the surveys was higher than the average American, not lower, as they had portrayed. So I think it was sort of I don't want to say elite, because I think this goes to the heart of some of the questions that Ezra Klein was drawing and this guy Carlos were drawing out. Like, what is it to be the elite? So in some sense, I think they were more elite. And then you have essentially the ungentlemanly revolt. That's really how I see the last decade of the Republican Party. You see the ungentlemanly revolt under Trump, and then DeSantis coming in behind and saying, well, I'm actually going to execute on this. I'm going to do this in less of a trolley way and more of a serious, competent executive. I think they used the term energy in the executive. I think that the guy was probably right. That would be a good title for DeSantis's book. I haven't read the book, but I'm just thinking that's a good title for DeSantis generally. Energy in the executive. And anyway, I find it to be a very organic transformation, based on the political victories and losses over the last 20 years in this country. But obviously it was portrayed as sort of cynical.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. You say, yeah, the Tea Party was an educated movement, and Romney won college educated twice. This was around the time of the Tea Party, although Romney wasn't, a Tea Party guy. Nobody says that about MAGA, though. So, in a way, the populists are sort of they're a different class of people, and sort of like I don't know just like if DeSantis like he naturally shifted that way or he blew with the wind. It's either was possible. I wouldn't have any way of knowing. But I think I think there was this sort of contradiction at the heart of the Tea Party, and that like a lot of people, I think like you, I'm assuming, were like they did believe in capitalism and small government and constitutional limits, and some people were into that stuff, and then a lot of people just they were interested in it because they thought Obama was born in Kenya, right? And so, like you say, this progression, but like there was polls in 2012. Like if Trump ran 2012, he was like actually ahead of the polls. He might have been able to win in 2012. And he, his entire thing, the only thing he talked about to get that popular on the right was Obama's birth certificate, right? And so to me, like there was like this reaction to Obama, and the liberals say it's racist, and I think like yeah, I mean I think the birther thing, I mean, is clearly there's something racist. I don't think there's logic, and I don't think there's real logic or like a defensible understanding of that. But I think that was sort of just like it was just like a tribalism from the start at the mass level, although it had this like veneer, this intellectual elite that did care about small government and these things that I like and you like. Um, but that sort of that MAGA was there, and it wasn't necessarily reactive to events. Do you sort of have a disagreement with that sort of sequence of events?
Yeah, look, it's that view of the Tea Party is really common in elite media, and it's couldn't be further from what I observed, honestly. Now, maybe just the three places that I was in, which was San Diego, California, um, Phoenix, Arizona, and Central Virginia. Um, so, the Tea Party was a diffuse movement. It's genuinely a popular and populist in that kind of core sense movement, in that there was no centralized leadership. I did not see nearly as many. I really felt like the media was nut picking. There would be one guy like that in a crowd of hundreds, and they would talk to him. I just didn't observe.
But
I,
the
I
birth
think that for
certificate
sure I
thing,
never observed. I don't think I ever
yeah,
once observed any hostility towards Obama because of his race. Um,
well, yeah,
and
I think it was. I
I
think
think there was a lot of suspicion, if anything, that Obama was sort of felt foreign, not because he was black, but because he seemed like a European intellectual. Um,
maybe,
and
maybe.
I think that is what he is. I mean, that he was sort of culturally held himself very much apart from America. Um, and I think they probably would have
Yeah,
reacted
yeah.
in a very similar way to Woodrow Wilson, honestly.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, John. I mean, John Kerry. He might have been just a darker John Kerry. I remember John Kerry was attacked on sort of the same grounds, although nobody said he was born abroad. Like who knows if there's
Well, Obama
there's
legitimately has this international past that
yeah,
made that
that's
more
true. That's
plausible,
true.
right? Like,
John Kerry had like yeah, okay, they're just like conspiracy
if
theories.
anything, that mentality and that particular conspiracy theory, I think represented something else about the Tea Party movement that, and it goes to the heart of why I've moved the same way that DeSantis has over time, is the number of people that I talk to. I would call them Tea Party grandmas, and I say that with the greatest affection, who would come up to me and they'd have their copy of the Constitution and they'd point into it and they'd say, like, see, if you just, this one weird trick, right? This one weird trick in the Constitution, we can make things go back to the way that they were. Um, and there was this like very sort of legalistic impulse to find one way to just prove that the Democrats were operating so far beyond the bounds of the Constitution. And it was a very naive sort of conception of politics, in my view. Now looking back, but it very much was my conception of politics at the time. Obviously, I didn't believe that Obama was born outside of the country, but if anything, I would say that stems from the same impulse. It was like, then we can get him out, you know, then we can get him out of the way because we think he's fundamentally ruining the country, and we got to find this one weird trick to restrain him somehow in the Constitution. But I think this goes to the second biggest misconception of the Tea Party that I just see repeated all the time, over and over again. In my view, again, this is anecdata; it's based on my experiences in the Tea Party. But the overemphasis of the limited government piece of this and the budget, it was a part of the Tea Party. It was something that was considered important, but it was, I think, equally an expression of cultural unease. That the country was transforming into something that was not recognizable. And of course the left reads that as racism, which I think is ridiculous. I think that there was this real cultural unease with it. And I remember one of the things that I sort of found funny at the time, and now look back, maybe find a lot less funny and perhaps a lot more wisdom in it. When I was in the Virginia Tea Party and I was like first joining, because I'd just gone to law school, right? Out there. And I was like, okay, well, I was involved with the Tea Party. I'm going to try to get involved with the Tea Party here. And there was basically this one lady, she was just going on and on about Lady Gaga, right? And how Lady Gaga was the worst and like representative of everything that was wrong about the direction of America. And I was like, that's silly. I like Lady Gaga, you know? um, but I think there was a lot more of that, like a lot more of the cultural unease with the direction, not only that Obama was taking the country, but generally like a lot of the presage of a lot of the culture war issues, the new development of the culture war issues around patriotism and American history, I think were very much starting to heat up. Um, and one of the biggest objections to Obama was exactly this view of America as, they often did not use this phrase, and Obama's very clever at making it sound much more moderate, but essentially this view of America as systemically racist, as like having, you know, deep flaws at its foundation. And I think there was a big reaction to that. So in many ways, I think it makes sense. I think a lot of the Tea Party people, again, I've seen some polls to this effect, but it is my impression. So take that for what it's worth. I don't have an enormous set of data to back this up, but my impression was the Tea Party was very much split and leaning more Cruz than Trump, that Cruz was much more of a Tea Party darling in 2016 than Trump. But most of them
Yeah.
voted for Trump in the general election, and then were quite happy. And then especially seeing how Trump was treated and how all of the norms, important norms in Washington, were dropped in response to Trump, I think a lot of them very much became like extreme MAGA people. I think it's a lot of the same people, but I don't think they were his initial base. I think like Trump's initial base in the primary in 2016 was very much, this goes back to one of the first episodes we did, but was very much like white working class people who are not attached to churches, were not actually doing well with small businesses and stuff. And that was the Tea Party demographic that really only swung to Trump, I think, for the general, and then became more fervent as his term went on.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have like a disagreement, which we fleshed out a little bit last week, but I think there's more to talk about. But we'll set it aside, like whether actually, Trump was sort of more of a sinner or sinned against in like violating American norms. I think that's like a big, I think that's a big disagreement. But to stay on the DeSantis thing, I wonder what you think about this. And I think that there's you know, one thing Klein and his guests talk about is that like every like successful presidential movement or candidate has like some kind of positive vision for the country, right? Obama was going to get us post-racial, even if we talk about like no more boomers and the arguments of the 1960s. Trump make America great again. There was a sense we're going to build things, and he says stupid things like we're going to send a woman to the moon, and he says like these or Mars or whatever, wherever he wants to send them. And it's always like this. There's just like, and it's sort of silly. And he talks about like whatever, the United Arab Emirates have a great airport. Why is everything look like crap? There was like this sense of like we're going to do great things, right? There was this there was this sort of agenda of dynamism and progress. And I think I haven't read the DeSantis book either. I listened to the Klein podcast, but I've watched a lot of DeSantis and heard a lot of what he says, and so it rings true from my impression. And so I'll take Ezra Klein's word for it that this is sort of the theme of the book is what's the positive vision here? Okay, there's people who want to brainwash your children with critical race theory and gender ideology. Okay, there's a deep state that doesn't like you. Okay, there's a media that's biased. You want to do things against them. Okay. What is the DeSantis vision of like what like a great country looks like, or like what he actually wants that's different? I mean, does the sort of the pro DeSantis right like have an answer to this? Do they have something besides just wanting to crush the enemies?
I mean, I think this does go to all of our deepest disagreements. I'm not feeling particularly positive, and I would wager that a lot of Republican voters and even a lot of independents are feeling the same way. I think this is a particularly dark time in American history, and I'm not sure that every campaign needs a positive vision. I mean, and even Trump's positive vision is, as you say, it's like it's all backwards looking, right? And that in itself is worth commenting on, right? It's backwards looking in it's trying to bring back part of what people inherently, especially on the right, feel that they've lost.
He's going to cut
A
deals.
way of life, and so I think I think actually I don't see it as particularly positive, and if you think about it that way, It's just saying we will make your life go back to the way it was before all this terrible stuff happened. And maybe that's enough for DeSantis too. I don't know that. I feel like we have this idea that everybody has to have this positive vision, and it comes very much from the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years of American politics. I don't know to what extent every person in the 19th century who ran for president had a positive vision. Strikes me Andrew Jackson had a pretty negative one when he ran. So I don't know. I don't know if that's one of those many conventional wisdoms that isn't actually true in the Acela corridor, or whether that is actually true and Americans are just such a fundamentally optimistic people that you need some kind of optimism. And to the extent that Ron DeSantis, I mean, I think to the extent somebody would ask him what his vision is, he'd just point to Florida, right? He'd say, life is good in Florida. People are free. We live much the way that we did, 20 or 30 years ago. There's none of this woke stuff. There were fewer COVID restrictions and it became a free state much earlier. We didn't have to deal with all of these problems. These problems aren't inevitable. Look, we can just go back to the way we were, but we have to do some very forceful things in politics and policy to get there.
Yeah. So as far as the whether optimism has always been there in America, so yeah, you talk about Andrew Jackson not very positive. There's a good book called Heirs to the Founders, and it follows the career of three important Americans who didn't become president: Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, and Henry Clay. And
I think that's one of the books behind here.
Oh, good.
I
Yeah,
haven't read it though. My husband read it.
Okay, yeah, it's very good. It's highly recommended. And like you listen to them talk, it quotes them extensively from their speeches in Congress or the Senate, and they are, and this was a time when rhetoric mattered a lot. Like, they didn't have television, they didn't have, sound bites. Like, people actually cared about, what members of Congress said, and it like moved people and it moved members, members of the bodies, and it's amazing, like the way they would talk. So you have this quote from I think John Adams, who says, I study politics, so and philosophy, so my children will study music and art, or something like that. It's just like we are like so advanced that like us people in the late 18th century are sort of going to solve these problems. And if they could like see our level of wealth, they would. I think from their perspective, it would be like, you guys should be, you guys should be really happy with the world. I mean, I think objectively they would say that, and they would see probably spiritual problems. But then you have this next generation, like Webster and Clay and Calhoun. And Calhoun was, getting pretty angry because, the slavery issue of this, and other things, the regional rivalry between the North and the South. But like Webster and Clay, their speeches are just like, we conquered this continent, we did all these awesome things, we're going to keep doing awesome things, right? Andrew Jackson comes along, that's pretty negative. I mean, I think Abraham Lincoln fought a war, but I think he was pretty positive. I mean, I don't know much about how Polk's, they talked about the Mexican American War, but I assume there was a positive vision there. This was, the era of, and then you go Roosevelt, you go Kennedy, of course, you go Johnson, Clinton. Yeah, I mean, positivity is
all the bearded nothings in the middle.
I skipped the bearded nothings. I assume they were happy guys. I don't see them as firebrands. So yeah, I think that it does have a deep roots in American history.
I mean, you mentioned Henry Clay. I mean, it seems like there's actually a pretty fertile vein for either Trump or DeSantis to dig there, which is, I mean, Henry Clay's big thing was the American system, right? Building the American system using protectionism and then government funded projects. And FDR did, of course, much the same thing, to the extent that rebuild America's infrastructure, I think is a perennially popular issue, probably,
that's
and is
Trump,
something that is probably potent for both Trump and DeSantis, and especially is potent for that class of voters that voted for Obama a couple times and then voted for Trump and then probably voted for Biden. I guess one of the problems there is that Biden, one of the few things that he has sort of done, right, is he is willing to spend money on infrastructure, but that doesn't mean Trump can't make it his rhetorically. It was very much what Henry Clay did. I mean, I tend to think there's more. So whether on the optimism, whether I'm right or wrong about the optimism thing, I do think there are probably more parallels to the 19th century. I think we overuse, especially parallels in the World War II, right? We're constantly talking about how we're like Weimar Germany, and there might be something there, but I feel like it's overused, and we don't often look back to the 19th century. And in many ways, including especially like in foreign policy, right, where we're looking to move more to a multipolar world. I mean, that seems it's to some degree inevitable. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of fertile ground in explanatory power of our era, particularly in the Jacksonian era, and then into the lead up to the Civil War. Probably a lot more historical parallels to be mined and to be like lessons to be learned about the dangers of the era than it strikes me we're a lot closer to 1840 than we are to 1940
Yeah,
generally in
but
terms of our politics.
yeah. So I mean, going back to Trump and his sort of positive vision. I mean, I do think that there was that infrastructure thing. I'm a businessman. Remember, you're going to have so much winning. You're going to be saying, oh, "Please, we're sick of winning." I'm going to say, "Keep winning." I mean, it was so vague and sort of stupid, but I mean, it was just this sort of, this vision of like, it's just we're just going to be awesome. We're going to be like, all like, just like a 1980s sort of, movie of like the cool kids in high school or something. I mean, I think that's sort of the Trump appeal. All dark at the same time, immigrants, changing culture, blah blah blah, right? Um, but yeah, the DeSantis thing. Okay, well, I don't think it's. First of all, I don't think the country is. I don't think the country is there, right? So, like, you'll see polls like 60% of people say, don't change your, you can't change your gender, right? Or it's immoral to change your gender. You've seen these recent polls where, like, it's not looking good for the trans movement. At the same time, most Americans support gay marriage now. So something that was seen as, Republicans fought that was seen as extreme 10 years ago is now broadly popular. If you ask people, I've seen like polls with like contradictory stuff. If you ask people like, do we need to be more accepting of like LGBT, people will say yes. They say, have we gone too far in accepting LGBT? People will also say yes. So it's sort of like people have this like confused thing with like, okay, the trans stuff goes too far. But we all accept gay marriage now. That seems to be like where the median American voter is. There I don't see any like I see most people don't like affirmative action. They don't like a lot of the diversity stuff. I don't see like massive anger, over this issue. I think the same is with immigration. I think that like if you have a negative, you have a like a just a mostly negative vision. Um, the American people need to sort of be there with you for that, if that's ever going to work. Like, you're going to have like a majoritarian, sort of coalition on your side, and I just don't see that. Do you see it differently?
Yeah, I mean, in response to so I guess two things. So I'll respond to what you said about the anger. Yeah, I do see it. A lot of these issues. So anger is what brought out one of in my whatever time watching politics the most aggressive and successful parent movement in whatever. I don't know. I just don't know the history of how many times this has ever happened in politics, but an enormously potent political force of angry parents directly about what their children are learning in school. I think that element of the culture war is huge and
Mhm.
underestimate. I think it's actually
Yeah,
the
yeah,
opposite of what people are
yeah.
saying that, this is
I agree with
the
you.
anti
Yeah.
woke stuff is an elite phenomenon. This is a grassroots phenomenon, and parents are pissed about it. I think it's a combination of the school closures, but then what people were able to see during the school closures for the first time, they basically sat in on social studies classes, and there's this bias to think that it's basically like how it was when I was a kid, right? And they actually saw the content that was being given to their children. I don't think that's going away. Um, and the second thing I think people are is maybe more selective, but the diversity thing, I don't think they're sort of angry about it in abstract. It's more either the thing about what their kids are learning about America. They're white kids being told that they're inherently oppressive and being segregated from their classmates. I
I,
think
I
people are
agree
very
with you.
mad
I
about
agree
that.
with you on the school stuff. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think the more adult side of that, or unrelated to children, is, and I don't know how many people in America there are, and whether they're sort of politically about to be activated in the same way. But I think it'll happen at some point. I don't know if it's in this election, the next election. There are a lot of competent white men in this country who are not getting promotions, and they know why.
Yeah, I think
Or their
people
kids are
will be
not getting
making.
into
Yeah,
university, and they know why.
yeah, yeah. I think people have been making that argument. It's getting worse. I know it's getting worse. I think people have been making. I'm still waiting for the whites to to sort of wake up and just get sick of all the stuff. But
Well, but
what do you think?
it's accelerated so much since even since 2011 in terms of the in 2011 a lot of these things were a finger on the scale, and it was kind of hard to tell, and especially if you were an applicant, let's say to Harvard, right? It was kind of hard to tell because you don't it's not just GPA and SAT. Everyone applying has reasonably high numbers. That the selection rate is so low anyways that it's hard to tell. I think with these cases, and we can maybe talk about that, but with the cases in North Carolina against North Carolina and Harvard coming out, and the I think that this realization is just so much more blatant than it was in 2011. I think there are a lot of people who know that they did not get a promotion or their kid didn't get into a school because of the color of their skin, and I think that is a building.
Okay, so what do you think happened in the 2022 midterms? If you're right that there's this boiling anger at leftists and what they're doing, the best test of that should have been the midterms, right? And Republicans had a terrible midterm given the historical norm. So why wasn't there just a red wave?
So first of all, there were two red waves, as far as I know. One in Florida, which you can say is either it's the Ron DeSantis factor, but there was also one in New York. It just started from a low point, right?
Sure,
started
but
the red wave
that's
started
selective.
below
Sure,
sea level,
out of
but in
50
terms of
states, there were.
swing, no, but in
Yeah.
terms of swing, I think over the crime issue. So that's one. Two, I think Republicans didn't put forward any actual agenda at all. I don't think Republicans ran on a lot of this stuff except in the vaguest possible way. And that was very intentional on the part of McConnell. He told the Senate, uh, you know, told everybody running for Senate, Republicans, there is no agenda. There's no like bullet points. There's no slogan. We are just anti-Democrat. And I don't think that's very successful. Um, so, I mean, I think the parent movement is just as potent now. We talked about the Tea Party a minute ago. I worry that there's a limited window for the parent movement anyway, just because that's the nature of ground up movements. They can be quite successful. And I think this one will be, the important thing is how many W's, like actual long lasting policy W's they notch while they are sort of still engaged. Because people, I mean, you're working against a full time bureaucracy. People are not going to be able to stay mad and engaged forever. And then you always have the problem. I actually think the problem of the Tea Party was not the nuts. I think there were many fewer nuts than what the media portrayed as. What ended up killing the Tea Party was the grift, right? It was all of the PACs who were sending Tea Party grandma a like flyer that said, we're going to get Obama out of office. And all they were doing was paying their family members as consultants. I think the Tea Party got killed off by the grift more than the
Well,
nuts.
I think I agree with you that the parent movement is strong, and that's what Youngkin sort of that's the wave he rode. The and you have two good things there for conservatives, for Republicans. You have majority on your side. If you ask people, do you support teaching gender ideology or gender theory to third graders or whatever? Yes, most people say no. And then you have the intensity of preferences, like parents really care. So that's a winning combination. That's great. But I think all this other stuff, it matters. Like, okay, people like oppose diversity affirmative action, but look, like but they also care about other things too. Like a lot of people got a lot of women. I mean, I think the wave sort of like you're talking about like this anger rising up. I think it was women and the abortion issue in 2022, right? I think the bad candidates, Trump, the election style. So like you might be right. You might be right that like on net there's like some anger over the some of the issues, and from the conservative perspective, things that people will agree with Republicans on. It's just like it's not so like overboiling that it can, there's a lot of things people get angry about. It's not so overboiling that it's like going to be like something that's going to overcome everything. Even if Republicans ran on it, I think abortion was going to be more important than DEI, no matter what in 2022, even if Republicans had the best strategy imaginable. What I'm thinking is, like, if I think there's like has to be like a realization that, like, if DeSantis comes to power, I don't think it's likely at this point, but let's say DeSantis gets into power. Let's say he has Republicans in House and Senate. And let's say he lives up to the billing and, like, is just as effective in the federal government as he was in Florida, or something close to it. I think what it would be, and I don't think people should delude themselves with it. It would be a very like a 51% American agenda, like people who got over 55% or whatever, who got one, you got power in one election, best case scenario, does a lot of things, but they're going to have they're going to have a normal backlash to it because the American people are just not at the place where they want anything radical and are going to sort of fall in line behind it. Even he should still probably do all those things, but I just don't think there's like, a mass movement for like what DeSantis and what, people on the right want him to do. Yeah, that some of the stuff he can do it, but it's going to be costly, and it's going to be divisive, and there's going to be a backlash to it, like there always is whenever there's an ambitious agenda with the people in charge. Do you see it the same way?
So several things. One, to quote my good friend Rachel Bovard, political power has a purpose. It's not, you don't win elections so that you can put political power as a trophy on your shelf and polish it and look at it every day. You earn political capital and you spend it on behalf of the people who elected you. So yeah, some of those things will be less popular than some of the other things, but that's literally politics. So the second point, DeSantis actually is he's a good example of how leadership can lead polls on a lot of this stuff, right? So he had a core group of people who supported him on these issues, but he won the narrowest of margins. Right now, Trump, of course, out there saying it's he's taking credit for it.
He stole it. They say
Not
DeSantis stole the election.
not a totally illegitimate thing, by the way. It certainly helped DeSantis. There's, of course, another theory. My friend Bill Maddox wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal back when that election happened, and very clever analysis of. So DeSantis essentially won, I think it was about 100 or 200,000 votes that he, quote unquote, by statistics, should not have won from essentially Black and Latino women. And Bill makes a very convincing case that this is actually the result of the longer term school choice program in Florida, that Gillum ran really hard against eliminating that program, and that there were essentially corresponding numbers of people mothers who had their children in these programs actively. So they weren't voting in the abstract. They were people who, quote unquote, should have been in Gillum's column and switched to DeSantis. And I think he makes a pretty convincing case that actually school choice may have won DeSantis the election on that narrowest margin. But in any case, he's somebody who came into power with a 50-50 state and his agenda made it into a red state. Now, some of that's migration. Some of that has directly to do with, I bet you could say that's DeSantis' policies as well. If he hadn't taken the stand that he had on COVID, there wouldn't have been that mass migration into Florida. So he's built a durable majority on things that maybe initially he had a minority or 50% plus one behind him on. But I think this is just overall, this is another way in which we are more like the 19th century than we are for mid 20th. We have high turnout elections, relatively speaking, from previous baseline. We have high turnout elections and pretty polarized, visions of the world. And I like some of these things. I think you're right, for example, that the abortion issue especially drove out single women who are pulling away statistically, not just away from men or from the median voter, but also from married women. There's just a huge statistical outlier. I mean, single women are perhaps the hardest core constituency for the Democratic Party, right? Other than perhaps Black voters, but and much bigger constituency. Anyway, so I think yeah, a lot of these issues are going to be drivers on both sides, and it's a turnout game. So it's not so much about winning independence so much as it is about making sure that your turnout is just as high and your base is just as energized as the other side. So the abortion issue definitely energizes the left, and their voters. Trump himself is this kind of like two-sided coin, right? Where he drives huge Republican turnout, and you see this in the election results. He drives huge Republican turnout. He had a bigger turnout than he did last time, but he also drives Democrats out at the same time because they just really, really can't stand him, and it motivates them to go to the polls, and even in huge numbers. Now, how those two numbers balance out, who knows what happens in 2024? But I do think that, again, this is more like much less like the Karl Rove 50% plus one type elections, and much more like the 19th century where you have large turnout, very different visions for the future of the country, like, and sort of polarizing visions. Yeah. I mean, I'm repeating myself and being
Yeah.
inarticulate, but
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I like that point that leaders can sort of change public opinion. And yeah, I've written about DeSantis and what he did in Florida. I don't know what the secret is, but yes, I mean something worked to shift that state. And I don't think the migration was a huge thing. The numbers, you look at the numbers and it's just not enough people moving there. Maybe the people who moved there were like really excited and like talked all their friends into being conservative or something. That's a theory one could have.
I
But
also
it's not.
think it screwed us in New York. I think we would have gotten Zeldin if everyone hadn't moved to Florida. Anyway,
Yeah, maybe everyone's uncle who's just right wing, like just wasn't
yeah.
there to talk their ear off about how bad the liberals are. Yeah, I like that idea, and it would be, if we had a DeSantis presidency, it would be an interesting test of this because if you look at sort of approval ratings of presidents over time, George Bush hit like 90% after 9/11, and then went down and was eventually at like 28% or something, right? And so we had wide variation, and generally presidents tended to be popular. Like a normal presidential approval rating was like 55, 60. Now we've had three straight presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden, where the approval rating doesn't shift much. It doesn't get too high. It doesn't get too low. They all, and Trump most of all, right? And maybe Biden most of all. I mean, it's a very, very narrow range. I mean, they're within, 40, 45%. No matter what happens, right? Trump had a honeymoon period. Obama had a honeymoon. I think Biden might have had a little bit of a honeymoon period. But basically, these have all been 40 to 45%. And so the theory is maybe that's just those three presidents. Maybe it's just Biden, Obama, Trump. The other theory is that like this is just like sort of the internet age, fractured media, and like whoever the president is, we're going to be paying a lot of attention to him, and we're going to be picking at him and finding flaws, and he's going to be unpopular, right? Like we could have 40% approval presidents for the rest of our lives, whether the people like their agenda or not. And DeSantis, and if Biden wins next time, it's still going to be Biden. If Trump wins, it's going to be Trump, right? We're going to have a 40% approval the entire presidency. There's nothing, you can't imagine anything that would happen that would like get Biden or Trump to 60% approval. There's just like nothing, right? And almost impossible to imagine getting the 25% approval. Now, if you had a DeSantis and like he had like a governing majority and he was like competent and like good at his job and the economy was good, like could he be like could he be like, again, like we had with Clinton or Reagan, could he be a 55 60%, or Bush for most of his presidency, George W. Bush, something along those lines. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that. I don't know if it's theoretically possible. It's probably is theoretically possible. Is DeSantis sort of, would he wear well on a national level? I don't know, but I think that would be sort of like the interesting thing if we did have somebody other than Biden or Trump. I don't think there's a good chance we will have anyone besides Biden and Trump. So it's more theoretical than something we'll find out anytime soon.
No, I mean, I suspect you're right. I mean, in terms of the chances, not to be morbid, but I wonder what the chances are of like actuarial tables of Biden just dying during the election versus the chance that DeSantis beats Trump in the primary. Like, I wonder which side of that is less likely versus more likely. But sorry for the morbidity, but yeah, I mean, like you would think that something that would get the country to really high approval, would be something external. Except that I don't think even that is true anymore. You can see what happened with COVID, and maybe this is uniquely the fault of Trump. I mean, he just did not give people in those initial months of the pandemic any sense of kind of comfort or competency. And I know that now Republicans criticize, including DeSantis, is now criticizing him, saying like, you kept Fauci in power for way too long. But back in the 2020 election, in the middle of the 2020 election, and polls back this up, even Republicans thought he was just not handling it well. And I think a lot of it had to do with pure style, right? People enjoy the Trump show most of the time. They think he's really funny, and for good reason. But in that moment where things actually seemed really scary, the fact that there wasn't a steady hand on the tiller, I think really did weigh on Trump's chances. And the conventional wisdom in 2019 was Trump was going to cruise to reelect, right? Because he had a booming economy. And even though his approval rating...
I don't know if polls ever showed that. I mean, like if he had a booming, but Trump was always a 40% approval
Yeah,
rating.
so when I say cruise to reelection, I don't mean that Trump would ever get 60%. I'm saying like the good money was to bet on Trump winning the election by some small margin.
Maybe a 55% win or something like that.
Yeah. But COVID didn't bring us together, right? It went in the opposite direction now. And I wonder if even that kind of exterior event is capable of bringing
do you remember politics back together. Do you remember the 9/11 era? I think you're younger than me. Maybe you don't.
I remember it. I don't have a good perspective on it, not because of age. I remember it very clearly. But because I lived in Palo Alto, and the response was already, I mean, I really feel like Palo Alto's just chasing me in the world. Like I got away from it as quickly as I could, and now it's coming back. Like Palo Alto culture, Palo Alto people just running the entire country. I think that's a great negative to us. But there was no pull together after 9/11 in Palo Alto. The local paper on this day after 9/11, right, September 12th, 2001, ran their primary response to 9/11 was to worry about backlash against Muslims.
Really? That quickly?
Yeah.
You know,
that's like literally 24 hours.
Okay, that's surprising because I remember the culture of the time, and my impression was just like everyone was waving flags. You know, there's something called New York Road here, just in LA County, and I wondered why it was called New York Road, and then I saw a sign like in honor of like 9/11. So it was like a thing where like it seemed like Palo Alto must have been a different planet. But yeah, the Bay Area is weird. I guess nothing should surprise.
Yeah, no, I believe everyone when they say that people came together. You know, the liberal New York cheered when George W. Bush threw out the pitch at the Yankees game, right? Like, and Bush enjoyed really, really high approval ratings all through like that period, right? Obviously, they declined over time. There's a limit to that boost, but I don't see anything comparable even bringing. I think actually events from the outside now deepen our divisions. In other words, we are so divided over our vision for what this country is and should be, that exterior events just actually deepen those divisions. I think that's what happened in COVID, right? I think any chance to deal in a serious way from any sort of side of the COVID debates with COVID as a non-political issue disappeared in June 2020 when they allowed people to march after banning funerals, right? At that point, so many of the people, a lot of the Republicans that I knew who had been going along with a lot of the restrictions were like, well, no, screw this. Like, this is a hoax. This is this is just nonsense. And I think the same thing would happen.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And so on that sad note,
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We will, we'll see you next week.